Hi folks, this is essentially a sort of an early preview of a talk I'm giving next month. Please forgive I haven't really paid much attention to the slides, and forgive me referring to my notes here. Any designer, and for that matter any technologist, spends a lot of time dealing with the future. It's pretty much where we live. And right now, unfortunately, the future doesn't look too good. We see potentially a slew of potential dystopias in front of us. If we squint hard enough, we can see facial recognition technology, which currently has a false positive rate of around about 95%, deployed by militarized authoritarian regimes. We can envision an arms race around lethal autonomous weapons systems, which nations will deem unacceptable and abhorrent right up until the point in which their enemies start to use them. There is unfortunately a great deal to fear about the future. But of all the dystopias that face us, climate should alarm us the most. For years, climate scientists have essentially tiptoed around the topic, afraid of being labelled alarmists. We're now finally realising that climate alarmism is fully justified. David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, opens with a punch to the gut. It's worse, much worse than you think. In the Paris Accord, the world decided to try and do whatever it could to keep planetary warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even before the United States' pullout, and very likely pull out of Brazil in the near future, even before that happened, that figure now looks deeply implausible. The UN World Meteorological Organization now says that if every company does finally choose to implement their pledges per the Paris Protocol, then the likely impact will be a global temperature rise of around about 3 degrees Celsius. If we stick to our present course, in other words, if we don't make major cuts to emissions, recent estimates say we're likely on track for a global temperature rise of between 4 and 5 degrees. At 5 degrees of warming, the Earth is transformed, facing temperatures last witnessed 55 million years ago. We tend, of course, when we're talking about climate, to focus on sea level rises. Just last week, a study published in PNAS warned that our previous estimates of a 1 metre sea level rise by the end of the century was almost certainly too optimistic. We now probably will face double that increase this century. And of course, those sea levels will not stop at the end of that century. It's likely we actually have 40 metres of sea level rise already baked in with our existing emissions. What we don't yet know is how long it will take us to get to that point. If 5 degrees does come to pass, major global cities, Osaka, Shanghai, Miami, would be virtually drowned. Much of the Middle East and South Asia would be uninhabitable. The Hajj pilgrimage, for example, would become a physical impossibility. We can expect the desertification of mainland Europe. Newly thawed Canada and Siberia will become fertile lands and as such potential battlegrounds. If this comes to pass, we will face global crop failures, water wars and mass displacement. The Syrian crisis, for example, expelled 5 million refugees, and their arrival into Europe helped to push the continent into the hands of the far right. At 5 degrees of warming, we can expect roughly 20 times that number of climate refugees. So our current trajectory, if we do not act on this issue, essentially will see society devolving into a simple fight for survival. This time, we are the asteroid. This is the Humane Tech Meetup, and I think I've sort of made my name as someone active in the tech ethics field of late, but I have no doubt whatsoever that climate is the ethical issue of our generation and potentially our century. And it's not that the other issues in the ethical space, it's not that things like algorithmic bias or addiction or privacy, it's not that they're not important, they do deserve our attention. But if we fail on climate, human suffering becomes the dominant theme of the coming decades. It becomes the backdrop to our children's futures. And the tech industry holds enormous, frankly barely warranted power. We get to depict and then to realise the future of our world. But I think right now we're abrogating these global responsibilities. Designers are squandering their influence by focusing on minutiae, design systems, design ops, making themselves acquiescent, compliant, efficient, and scalable with business as usual. This is the very same business as usual that's dragging us toward 5 degrees of warming. We have to realise that our lives today are not sustainable. We cannot continue along these paths. And I can tell you from experience that that is a profound and deeply painful realisation. Coming to terms with it takes time. It requires that we mourn this world, that we go through these well-known steps of denial, anger, bargaining, and depression before we reach acceptance. But we must do that quickly, because the future needs people like us. Because on the other side lies hope. Our climate futures are going to be written in this coming decade. The trajectory we're on is horrifying, but it's not yet preordained. And so, of course, the question becomes, what can we do? Many of you will have seen advice like this previously. I won't focus too much on the personal impact. Perhaps I'll just mention two. Bitcoin, sell your Bitcoin. It uses the same amount of energy as Austria. And then at this bottom point, this is a controversial and even dangerous point sometimes in climate discourse. But the estimated carbon footprint of the average Western child is 373,000 kilograms, which is the same as about 40 years of heavy flying. Short of starting a wildfire, having a child is the largest environmental decision that you can make. But this is really about our professional opportunities to make a difference. Making a professional impact at the moment, some of the best advice seems to be focusing on data centers. Data centers generate as much greenhouse gas emissions as the entire aviation industry. It's around about 2%. Get your company's data centers off AWS particularly. Amazon are repeatedly failing to live up to their previously public pledges to move to renewables. There are actually differences in the regions for AWS. If you can't get off AWS, at least move to, I can't remember which ones, I'm afraid, but I can look it up. There are certain regions in AWS that offer renewable sources. We absolutely have to come together as a community. We need to ally with like-minded peers. I'm part of a Slack group, climateaction.tech, where there's fantastic discourse involving people who have been in these trenches for a long time. Pressuring companies to reduce flying, to offset where possible. Offsets are a little bit controversial, but the evidence does seem to suggest that they have some utility. And obviously this means investing in things like video conferencing infrastructure as well to reduce the needs of frequent flying. But for me, probably the most important things are these last two. We need to find a way to reject this mentality of permanent growth. It simply cannot continue. We have to find ways to either completely abandon or abolish, or at least to counterbalance growth metrics. I would say if you're building a product and your primary metrics of success are growth, then it's very likely that you're contributing somehow to this emerging crisis. And really this entails prioritizing society's needs over user needs, over business needs. If in doubt, your loyalty is to the future, not to your employer. Now, for reasons of time, this is a very gloomy talk. But I do think there is cause for hope. I think, more than anyone else, technologists get to shape what happens next. Whenever we make, whenever we design, we are making a statement about the future. We're making a claim for how we should interact with technology, and therefore, by extension, how we should interact with each other. At that same time, we're discarding millions of alternative futures. So the world has to come to terms with this climate dread, essentially, but it can't stop there. We have to find ways to encourage people through that process and beyond it. Fatalism is functionally exactly the same as business as usual. So I think we, technologists and designers, we have a moral duty to paint a picture of better, more sustainable futures. We need to entice people through that dread, through that mourning process, and then to essentially help them realize that if we pull together, if we work together collectively, then there are better futures potentially on the horizon. And to do that effectively, we have to lift our eyes to broader horizons in front of us. We need to forget the trivia of our industries, and we need instead to start talking with urgency and, yes, some hope about the world to come. Thanks.